Bullies kissed his girlfriend in front of him. He made them both regret it. Owen Blake had learned to make himself invisible. It was a skill he'd perfected over the 3 months since transferring to Riverside High School, a sprawling brick complex that sat on the edge of a town where everyone seemed to know everyone except him. He'd slide through the hallways with his shoulders slightly hunched, his backpack positioned just right to create a barrier between himself and the world, his eyes fixed on a point about 6 feet ahead that let him navigate without making eye contact with anyone who mattered. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their constant mechanical drone, mixing with the slam of lockers and the thunder of hundreds of feet on worn linoleum, creating a wall of sound that Owen had learned to disappear into. His family had moved here in August, when his father got transferred from the overseas military base where they'd spent the last several years. His mother had been optimistic about the fresh start, about finally putting down roots in America after so many years abroad. His younger sister had adapted quickly, making friends in her middle school with the easy confidence of someone who didn't carry the weight of too many goodbyes. But Owen had arrived at Riverside High at the worst possible time, when social hierarchies were already cemented, when friend groups had years of history, when being the new kid meant being nobody. The cafeteria was the worst, a massive space with industrial beige walls and long tables arranged in invisible but absolute territorial divisions. It was where the social order of Riverside High revealed itself with brutal clarity. The athletes claimed the center tables, their Letterman jackets and loud voices announcing their dominance. The popular crowd occupied the prime real estate near the windows, their laughter and gossip creating an impenetrable bubble. The various tribes of the school, band kids, theater people, gamers, stoners, each had their designated zones. And then there were the edges, the margins, the forgotten corners where people like Owen tried to exist without drawing attention. He'd chosen a small table near the back, partially hidden by a structural pillar, where he could eat his lunch and study without being noticed. It had worked for almost 2 weeks before Dylan Hartwell found him. Dylan was everything Owen wasn't. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy athletic grace that came from years of football practice, and the confidence of someone who'd never questioned their place in the world. His sandy blonde hair was always perfectly styled. His smile was practiced and predatory, and he moved through Riverside High like he owned it. In many ways, he did. His father was some big shot in town, his family had money, and Dylan had been the star quarterback since sophomore year. People orbited around him, desperate for his approval, terrified of his attention. Owen had been eating a sandwich, his chemistry textbook propped open in front of him, when Dylan's shadow fell across the table. He'd looked up to find Dylan and his crew standing there, Trevor Moss and Brandon Cole flanking him like always. Trevor was the muscle, thick-necked and mean-eyed, the kind of guy who'd probably peaked in high school and would spend the rest of his life talking about it. Brandon was smaller, sharper, with the cruel wit of someone who'd learned early that words could cut as deep as fists. Dylan hadn't said anything at first. He'd just reached down, picked up Owen's water bottle, and dumped it across Owen's textbook. The water had spread across the pages, warping them instantly, destroying hours of notes Owen had made in the margins. The cafeteria noise had seemed to dim, or maybe Owen's hearing had just narrowed, focusing on the drip, drip, drip of water hitting the floor. "Oops," Dylan had said, his voice flat with mock sincerity. "My bad, new kid." Owen had stared at the ruined book, feeling heat rise in his face, feeling his hands clench under the table. He'd wanted to stand up, to say something, to do something, but he'd sat there, frozen, while Dylan and his friends walked away laughing. The few students who'd witnessed it had quickly looked away, returning to their lunches, unwilling to get involved. That was the social contract at Riverside High. You didn't interfere, you didn't help. You just tried to make sure you weren't next. That had been the beginning. Small things at first. A shoulder check in the hallway that sent Owen's books scattering, his locker jammed with gum, his backpack kicked across the floor in study hall. Brandon would make comments as Owen walked past, loud enough for everyone to hear, but quiet enough for teachers to miss. "Hey, check out the ghost," he'd say. "Does he even talk?" Maybe he doesn't speak English. The other students would laugh or look away, and Owen would keep walking, his face burning, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. The parking lot after school was particularly bad. Dylan and his crew would hang around their trucks, expensive vehicles their parents had bought them, and they'd make a show of noticing Owen walking past toward the bus stop. They'd rev their engines, holler comments that were just ambiguous enough to avoid real trouble. Sometimes they'd throw things, balled up fast food wrappers, empty soda cans. Once, a full can of energy drink had exploded at Owen's feet, soaking his jeans. He'd stood there, sticky liquid seeping into his shoes, while Dylan had laughed from his truck window. The worst part wasn't the harassment itself. Owen had dealt with bullies before, in the various schools he'd attended around the world. Military bases had their own social dynamics, their own hierarchies. The worst part was the helplessness, the knowledge that complaining would only make things worse, the understanding that the adults didn't really care or couldn't do anything even if they did, the constant low-grade anxiety that made his stomach hurt and his sleep restless. Owen's home life was his only refuge. His parents were good people, busy with their own adjustments, but caring in their distracted way. His mother worked long hours at a local hospital, trying to rebuild her nursing career after years of following his father's postings. His father, a career military man who'd retired to take a civilian defense contracting job, was often away on business trips. They lived in a modest ranch house on a quiet street lined with similar houses, each with their neat lawns and two-car garages. It was quintessentially American, exactly what his mother had wanted, but it felt temporary to Owen, like they were guests in someone else's life. His room was his sanctuary. Posters of martial arts films covered one wall, remnants of his childhood passion. In the corner sat a heavy bag he'd brought from their previous posting, still in its shipping box because he hadn't felt like unpacking it. On his desk, amid scattered homework and gaming controllers, was a framed photo of his old sensei, Master Takashi, a Japanese-American instructor who taught at the base dojo overseas. Owen hadn't trained seriously in almost a year, not since the move had disrupted everything. He'd told himself he was too busy, too focused on adjusting. The truth was messier. Training meant confronting the person he used to be, and that person felt impossibly far away from the invisible ghost he'd become at Riverside High. The gym class was where things escalated. It was a massive space with gleaming hardwood floors, basketball hoops at either end, and a persistent smell of sweat and floor wax. Coach Reynolds was the kind of teacher who believed in building character through competition and letting kids work things out themselves, which meant he was basically useless when it came to any conflict that didn't involve a ball and a scoreboard. They'd been playing basketball, teams divided by some arbitrary method that ensured Owen ended up guarding Trevor. Trevor, who had 6 inches and 40 pounds on him, had immediately started playing rough. Elbows to the ribs, shoulders to the chest. The kind of physical intimidation that could be explained away as just playing hard. Owen had tried to hold his own, but he was outmatched physically, and everyone knew it. When Owen had managed to steal the ball and drive toward the basket, Trevor had caught him from behind, wrapping his arms around Owen's waist and slamming him to the floor. The impact had knocked the wind out of Owen's lungs, left him gasping on the polished wood, while Trevor stood over him, grinning. Coach Reynolds had blown his whistle, called a foul, and told them both to take it easy. Trevor had offered Owen a hand up, a gesture of mock sportsmanship that was really just another form of humiliation. Owen had ignored the hand and stood up on his own, his side aching, his face hot with shame. That had been the pattern. Small violations, constant pressure, always just below the threshold that would force adult intervention. In the hallways between classes, Dylan and his friends would create these moving walls of bodies that Owen had to navigate around. In the library, where Owen tried to study during free period, they'd take seats nearby and make just enough noise to destroy his concentration without being loud enough to get kicked out. In the cafeteria, they'd walk past his table and accidentally bump into him, sending his lunch tray sliding or knocking his books to the floor. Owen had developed strategies. He'd learned which hallways to avoid, which routes took longer but were safer. He'd learned to time his movements, to arrive at class just as the bell rang, so there was no lingering in doorways where confrontations could happen. He'd learned to eat his lunch quickly and leave the cafeteria, spending the rest of the period in a bathroom stall or wandering the least populated corridors. He'd learned to make himself smaller, quieter, less present. But he'd also started to feel himself disappearing, not just from others' view, but from his own sense of self. The person he'd been before Riverside High, someone who'd had friends and confidence and a sense of purpose, was fading like an old photograph. In its place was this hollow thing that went through motions, that survived but didn't live, that accepted humiliation as the price of getting through each day. It was early October when he met Lily Matthews. The leaves were just starting to turn, splashes of red and gold against the grey October sky, and there was that particular crisp quality to the air that marked the transition into fall. Owen had been in the library, tucked into his usual corner near the art and photography section, trying to focus on his English assignment. The library was one of the few places he felt relatively safe, a two-story space with tall windows and rows of books that created natural hiding spots. Lily had appeared suddenly, dropping a stack of art books on the table across from him with a soft thud. She was small and slight with dark curly hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing paint-stained jeans and an oversized flannel shirt. Her hands were decorated with small doodles in pen, tiny flowers, and geometric patterns that climbed up her forearms. She'd looked at him with these intense green eyes and said, "You mind if I sit here? The other tables are full of people pretending to study while they actually just gossip." Owen had been so surprised by someone directly addressing him that he'd just nodded. Lily had smiled, a quick, genuine expression, and sat down, immediately opening one of her books and pulling out a sketch pad. For a while, they'd just worked in comfortable silence, the kind that felt more connected than most conversations Owen had experienced since arriving at Riverside High. After about 20 minutes, Lily had looked up. "You're Owen, right? The new kid?" He'd nodded again, his default response to most direct questions. "I'm Lily. I sit behind you in English, though I'm not sure you've noticed. Mrs. Patterson's class?" He had noticed, actually. Lily was one of the few people who'd never joined in the low laughter when Dylan or Brandon made their comments. She'd always seemed absorbed in her own world, sketching in the margins of her notebook, sometimes looking out the window with an expression that suggested she was somewhere far away from Riverside High. "Yeah," Owen had finally managed to say. Yeah, I know." They'd fallen into an easy pattern after that. The library became their unofficial meeting spot during lunch and free periods. Lily would work on her art projects while Owen studied or read. They'd talk sometimes, small conversations that gradually grew more substantial. She told him about her passion for photography and painting, about her plans to apply to art schools in California and New York. He told her about moving around with his military family, about living overseas, though he'd carefully edited out any mention of his martial arts training. That part of his life felt too private, too connected to a version of himself he wasn't sure existed anymore. Lily was different from anyone else at Riverside High. She seemed immune to the social hierarchies that governed everyone else's lives. She was friendly with various groups, but belonged to none of them. She spoke her mind without seeming to care about the consequences. She was kind in a world that often seemed to punish kindness. Owen found himself looking forward to their library sessions. She made him feel visible again, but in a good way. She'd ask his opinion about her artwork, genuinely interested in his responses. She'd share her observations about their classmates and teachers, sharp and funny without being cruel. She had a way of seeing through the performance of high school to the real people underneath. It was Lily who first asked him directly about the bullying, about 3 weeks after they'd started spending time together. They'd been sitting in the library, afternoon sun slanting through the tall windows, when she'd set down her pencil and looked at him with those observant green eyes. "Dylan Hartwell is a piece of work," she'd said without preamble. "I saw what he did to you in the cafeteria yesterday." Owen had felt his face heat up. Yesterday had been particularly bad. Dylan had walked past Owen's table and deliberately swept his arm across it, sending Owen's lunch tray crashing to the floor. The sound had been tremendous in the relative quiet of the lunch period, spaghetti and milk spreading across the tiles, and Owen had just sat there while the entire cafeteria had turned to look, while Dylan had laughed and kept walking, while the janitor had appeared with a mop and a disappointed expression. "It's fine," Owen had said, the automatic response he'd developed for everything. "It's not fine," Lily had said firmly. "He's an asshole. His whole crew are assholes. I don't understand why people worship him just because he can throw a football." Owen had shrugged, uncomfortable with the direct attention to his humiliation. "You know his dad basically owns half the town, right?" Lily had continued. "That's the only reason he gets away with everything." "Well, that, and the fact that he's the star quarterback. This town has a weird obsession with high school football. It's actually kind of sad." "Why does he even bother with me?" Owen had asked, a question that had haunted him since this all started. "I don't matter. I'm nobody here." Lily had looked at him with something like anger, though not directed at him. "You matter. And guys like Dylan, they're not happy unless they're making someone else miserable. It makes them feel powerful. It's pathetic, actually, when you think about it. They're so insecure that they need to tear other people down just to feel okay about themselves." Her words had made sense intellectually, but they didn't change the daily reality of Owen's existence at Riverside High. Understanding why Dylan was a bully didn't make him less of a bully. Still, having Lily acknowledge what was happening, having someone see him and see the injustice of it, had meant something Owen couldn't quite articulate. Over the following weeks, Lily and Owen's friendship had deepened. They'd started texting in the evenings, sharing music and memes and long conversations about everything from philosophy to favorite movies. She'd introduced him to her friend group, a loose collection of artists and musicians who hung out in the art room after school. They were weird in the best way, passionate about their creativity, largely indifferent to the mainstream social dynamics of the school. For the first time since arriving at Riverside High, Owen had started to feel like maybe he could belong somewhere. Dylan had noticed. Of course, Dylan had noticed. People like Dylan made it their business to notice when their targets started showing any signs of happiness or independence. It had started with comments. Brandon would make jokes about the ghost finally making a friend, or looks like the loser found another loser. Trevor would make kissing noises when Owen walked past. But these were just the warning shots, the preview of what was coming. The real escalation had happened at the Halloween dance. Riverside High had a tradition of throwing a big Halloween bash in the gym, transforming the space with elaborate decorations, a DJ, and a general atmosphere of sanctioned chaos. Owen had never planned on going. Dances weren't his thing, but Lily had convinced him. She'd been excited about it, had wanted to show off the costume she'd designed, and Owen had found himself unable to say no to her enthusiasm. The gym had been transformed with orange and purple lights, fake cobwebs, and inflatable decorations. The music had been loud enough to make conversation nearly impossible, the bass vibrating through the floor. Lily had looked beautiful in a vintage witch costume she'd put together from thrift store finds, complete with an elaborately painted face that highlighted her artistic talent. Owen had gone with something simple, a dark hoodie and face paint that Lily had helped him apply. They danced, awkward and laughing, in the massive bodies on the gym floor. For a few hours, Owen had forgotten about everything else, caught up in the moment, in Lily's smile, in the simple joy of being young at a high school dance. It had felt like the kind of memory that would matter years later, a bright spot in an otherwise difficult time. Dylan had been watching. Dylan was always watching. Owen had gone to get drinks from the refreshment table, navigating through the crowd. When he'd returned, punch cups in hand, he'd seen Dylan talking to Lily. At first it had seemed innocuous, just Dylan being Dylan, working his charm on everyone regardless of whether they wanted it. But as Owen had gotten closer, he'd seen Lily's body language, the way she'd stepped back, the way her smile had become fixed and polite rather than genuine. Dylan had seen Owen approaching, and his smile had widened. Before Owen could process what was happening, before he could say or do anything, Dylan had leaned in and kissed Lily. Not a quick peck, but a full aggressive kiss, one hand on the back of her head, making a show of it for the students nearby who'd turned to watch. Lily had shoved Dylan away hard, her face a mixture of shock and anger. But the damage had been done. Owen had stood there, frozen, the plastic cups of punch forgotten in his hands. Dylan had turned to him, that predatory smile fully in place, and winked. "Sorry, man," Dylan had said, loud enough to be heard over the music. "Didn't realize you two were a thing." Though honestly, she can do better, right? Trevor and Brandon had materialized from the crowd, laughing, forming a wall between Owen and Dylan. The students nearby had been watching now, some with their phones out, capturing the moment. Owen had felt everything in him go cold and then hot, a fury rising up that he hadn't felt in years. His hands had clenched, crushing the plastic cups, punch spilling over his fingers. Lily had pushed past Dylan, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she'd shouted at Dylan, but her voice had been swallowed by the music. She'd grabbed Owen's arm. "Come on, let's get out of here." But Owen hadn't moved. He'd been staring at Dylan, at that smug face, feeling years of training and discipline warring with the raw anger flooding through him. Every instinct Sensei Takashi had drilled into him had been screaming that this was the moment, that he could end this right now. He could see the openings in Dylan's stance, could calculate the exact moves that would put the arrogant quarterback on the floor. "Owen," Lily had said urgently, tugging at his arm, "let's go." "He's not worth it." Something in her voice, the fear mixed with anger, had broken through his rage. Owen had let her lead him out of the gym, past the staring students, past the chaperones who were just beginning to register that something had happened. They'd ended up outside in the October night, the cold air shocking after the heat of the gym, and Owen had stood there shaking while Lily had paced, furious. "I'm going to report him," she'd said. "That was assault. He can't just do that." But Owen had known better. They both knew better. Dylan was protected by his status, by his family's influence, by the same systems that allowed him to terrorize Owen without consequences. Any complaint would be dismissed as "he said, she said." It would only make things worse. The next day, Owen had stayed home from school, claiming he was sick. It wasn't entirely a lie. He'd felt physically ill, his stomach churning, his head pounding, but mostly he'd needed time to think, to process, to figure out what he was going to do, because something had shifted in that moment when Dylan had kissed Lily. A line had been crossed, and Owen could feel something inside him that had been compressed and contained, suddenly demanding release. His room had felt like a cell that day. He'd paced, sat on his bed, stared at the ceiling. Around noon, he'd finally gotten up and unpacked the heavy bag from its box in the corner. The familiar weight and texture of it had been like greeting an old friend. He'd hung it from the ceiling mount he'd installed years ago, and then he'd just stood in front of it, his hands resting on the worn leather surface. The photo of Sensei Takashi had caught his eye from across the room. The old master's weathered face, wise eyes, the hint of a smile. Owen had remembered the lessons that had nothing to do with punching or kicking. Martial arts is not about fighting, Sensei had said countless times. It is about harmony, about balance, about being prepared so that you never need to use it. But Sensei had also taught Owen how to break boards, how to disable an opponent, how to use his body as a weapon when absolutely necessary. There is a difference, Sensei had said, between seeking violence and being capable of violence. The warrior avoids conflict when possible, but when conflict is unavoidable, the warrior must be decisive. Owen had made a decision that day. He was done being invisible, done being a victim, done letting Dylan and his crew dictate how he moved through the world. But he was also determined to do this the right way. Not revenge, not cruelty, but justice. Defense, not aggression. When Owen had returned to school the following Monday, something was different about him. It was subtle, nothing anyone could point to directly, but students seemed to sense it. The way he walked was straighter, his shoulders back instead of hunched. The way he made eye contact instead of looking away. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't submissive either. It was present. Dylan had noticed immediately. At lunch, when Dylan had walked past Owen's table, ready for his usual routine, Owen had looked up and met his eyes directly. For just a moment, Dylan had hesitated, confused by this unexpected response. But then he'd recovered, knocking Owen's textbook off the table with his typical casual cruelty. Owen had bent down to pick it up without rushing, without showing any reaction beyond a calm acknowledgement that it had happened. Lily had noticed too. "Something's different about you," she'd said when they'd met in the library later that day. "Did something happen?" "I'm done," Owen had said simply. Done being scared. Done letting them win. Lily had studied his face, worried. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," Owen had admitted, "but I'm not going to keep living like this." The harassment had continued, but Owen had stopped reacting the way Dylan expected. When Brandon had made his usual comments in the hallway, Owen had just looked at him calmly and kept walking. When Trevor had body-checked him in gym class, Owen had stayed on his feet, absorbing the impact without going down. These small resistances had seemed to frustrate Dylan and his crew, like they were hitting a wall instead of the yielding target they'd grown accustomed to. But Owen had known that wasn't enough. Passive resistance would only escalate Dylan's anger. He needed something more. He needed to become stronger, faster, more confident. He needed to remember who he'd been before Riverside High had ground him down into nothing. That was when he'd found Coach Martinez. The PE department had 3 coaches, and Owen had mostly dealt with Coach Reynolds. But Coach Martinez was different. She taught the weight training class and ran the wrestling program. A compact woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and an intensity that commanded respect. Owen had seen her break up fights in the hallway with nothing but her presence and a sharp word. She took no nonsense from anyone, regardless of their status in the school's hierarchy. Owen had found her in the weight room one day after school, spotting for a student on the bench press. He'd waited until the student was done and had left before approaching. "Coach Martinez," he'd said, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "Can I talk to you?" She'd looked him over with sharp, assessing eyes. "Owen Blake, right? You're in Reynolds' 3rd period PE?" He'd nodded, surprised she knew his name. "You move well," she'd said. "I've noticed. You have training." It hadn't been a question, but Owen had answered anyway. "Yes, ma'am." "Martial arts, karate and some judo, from when I lived overseas." Why'd you stop? The direct question had caught him off guard. When we moved here, things were different. You didn't what? Forgot how. Her tone had been challenging but not unkind. No, ma'am. Then what's stopping you from remembering? Owen had looked at her, at this fierce woman who seemed to see through all his carefully constructed defenses, and he'd made another decision. Nothing, I guess. Coach Martinez had smiled, a quick, sharp expression. Good answer. Weight room is open after school until 5. You want to train, you train. You want to quit being whoever you're pretending to be, that's on you. But I'll tell you this. I don't tolerate bullying in my programs, and I see everything that happens in this school. Everything. You understand me? Yes, ma'am. Then get to it. Owen had started spending every day after school in the weight room. Coach Martinez had watched him for the first few sessions, correcting his form on lifts, pushing him harder than he'd pushed himself. But she'd also given him space to work through his own routine, to rebuild the discipline and focus he'd let atrophy over the past months. The heavy bag in his room had become his evening ritual. He'd start with basics, the simple techniques Sensei Takashi had drilled into him thousands of times. Jab, cross, hook, front kick, roundhouse, side kick. The movements had felt rusty at first, his body remembering but not quite coordinated. But slowly, over days and then weeks, it had come back. The fluidity, the power, the sense of being connected to something larger than himself. His father had noticed the changes. One evening, he'd come home from a business trip and found Owen working the heavy bag, sweat soaking through his shirt, his knuckles wrapped in tape. They'd stood there for a moment, father and son, the rhythmic thud of fists on leather filling the silence. "You training again?" his father had asked. "Yes, sir." His father had nodded slowly. "Good. Man should know how to defend himself." But Owen, and here his father's voice had grown serious, knowing how and needing to are different things. "You remember what Sensei Takashi taught you about control?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Because I see that look in your eyes, and I know that look. I've had that look. Whatever you're dealing with, son, you make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. You hearing me?" "Yes, sir." His father had clapped him on the shoulder and left, and Owen had gone back to his training, but the conversation had stayed with him. Right reasons, not revenge, not proving anything to Dylan, but self-respect, dignity, the right to exist without fear. The November air had turned cold, the leaves mostly fallen now, bare branches scratching against grey skies. The football season was reaching its climax, with Riverside High's team heading toward the state playoffs. Dylan was in his element, the star of every game, his face plastered on posters around town, local news doing features about the golden boy who was probably headed to a Division I school on a full scholarship. The adulation had made Dylan worse, more aggressive, more confident that he was untouchable. The harassment had intensified in ways that were harder to ignore. Things had started disappearing from Owen's locker. His backpack had been stolen and found later in the dumpster behind the cafeteria. Someone had keyed his mother's car in the school parking lot, though Owen couldn't prove who. But Owen had kept training, every day in the weight room with Coach Martinez watching, every evening with the heavy bag in his room. He'd started running too, early morning runs through his neighborhood when the streets were empty and the air was sharp with frost. His body had been changing, getting stronger, leaner, more efficient. But more than that, his mind had been changing. He'd been finding that center, that calm place Sensei Takashi had always talked about. Lily had been his anchor through all of it. She'd made him promise not to do anything stupid, not to let Dylan goad him into a fight that would only get Owen expelled. But she'd also supported his training, understood why he needed to do this. They'd grown closer, their relationship evolving into something that felt like more than friendship, but hadn't been explicitly defined. They'd studied together, walk each other to class, sit together at lunch. She'd take his picture sometimes for her photography projects, capturing him in moments when he wasn't paying attention. Dylan had noticed their growing closeness, and it had infuriated him. His harassment had increasingly included Lily, comments about her appearance, her art, her choice to spend time with the ghost. She'd handled it with more grace than Owen could manage, usually with some cutting remark that made Dylan look stupid in front of his friends. But Owen had seen how it wore on her, how she'd grown quieter, more guarded. The breaking point had come in late November, the week of Thanksgiving break. The school had been buzzing with excitement about the upcoming state playoff game, the potential championship, the possibility of Riverside High achieving something they hadn't in decades. Dylan had been riding high on the attention, his arrogance at an all-time peak. Owen and Lily had been in the library, their usual spot, working on a project for English class. They'd been analyzing poetry, discussing themes and structure, the kind of normal student activity that had become precious to Owen because it represented everything his life at Riverside High usually wasn't: peaceful, intellectual, connected. Dylan, Trevor and Brandon had walked in, loud and disruptive, despite the librarian's sharp look. They'd made a show of finding seats nearby, close enough to intrude on Owen and Lily's space, without being obvious enough to get kicked out. The whispered comments had started immediately, just loud enough for Owen and Lily to hear, but quiet enough that the librarian couldn't identify the source. Lily had tried to ignore them, focusing on her textbook with increasing intensity. Owen had felt the familiar anger rising, but had pushed it down, centered himself the way he'd been practicing. They'd almost made it to the end of the period when Dylan had accidentally knocked Lily's bag off the table as he walked past, spilling her art supplies and sketchbooks across the floor. Lily had jumped up, frustrated and embarrassed, kneeling to gather her things. Owen had knelt beside her, helping to collect the scattered pencils and charcoal sticks. And that's when Dylan had stepped on Lily's sketchbook, grinding his heel into the pages, deliberately tearing the paper and smudging weeks of careful work. Owen had felt something snap inside him, that carefully maintained control finally fracturing. He'd stood up fast, coming face to face with Dylan. For a moment, they'd just stood there, barely a foot apart, the library suddenly silent around them. Owen had looked at Dylan, really looked at him, seeing past the bravado to the insecurity underneath, the need to dominate, the fear of being ordinary. "Move," Owen had said, his voice low and steady. Dylan had smiled that predatory smile. "Or what, Ghost? You finally going to do something? Been waiting for this?" The librarian had appeared then, Ms. Chen, her sharp voice cutting through the tension. "What's going on here? All of you out, now." They'd dispersed, but Owen had known something fundamental had shifted. He'd seen recognition in Dylan's eyes, a understanding that the game had changed, that Owen wasn't the same scared kid who'd arrived at Riverside High 3 months ago, and Dylan had seemed almost excited by it, like he'd been waiting for Owen to finally fight back so he'd have an excuse to truly destroy him. That evening, Owen had trained harder than ever before. Coach Martinez had stayed late, watching him work through combinations on the heavy bag, his technique sharp and precise. When he'd finally stopped, his knuckles bruised despite the wraps, his shoulders burning, she'd tossed him a water bottle. "Whatever you're working through," she'd said, "make sure you're in control of it, and it's not in control of you." "How do you know it's not?" Owen had asked. "Because you're here training instead of out there proving something. That shows discipline." But Owen, and she'd waited until he met her eyes, discipline isn't just about holding back. It's also about knowing when to act. You can't live your whole life being afraid of your own strength. Her words had echoed in his mind as he'd driven home in his mother's repaired car, the November darkness pressing against the windows. At home, his sister had been decorating for Thanksgiving, enthusiasm spilling over as she tried to engage Owen in planning the family meal. His mother had been in the kitchen making pies, the smell of cinnamon and apples filling the house. For a moment, watching his family in their warm, normal routine, Owen had felt the disconnect between this world and the war zone of Riverside High. His father had found him later, sitting on the back porch despite the cold. "You okay, son?" "I don't know," Owen had admitted. "There's this guy at school, Dylan Hartwell. He's been making my life hell since I got here, and now he's targeting Lily too." His father had sat down beside him, silent for a long moment. "The Hartwell family. Big football donors, right? I've heard of them. Entitled and used to getting their way. He kissed Lily at a dance to humiliate me. And today he destroyed some of her art. And I just stood there, Dad. I keep just standing there. Standing there takes strength too, son. More than most people realize. But there's a point where standing there becomes complicity in your own humiliation. You finding that point?" "I think so." "Then you do what you need to do. But you remember your training. It's not about hurting him. It's about making sure he can't hurt you or anyone you care about anymore. You understand the difference?" Owen had nodded, understanding perfectly. The week of Thanksgiving break had given Owen time to think, to plan, to prepare himself mentally for what felt inevitable. His family had celebrated the holiday with their typical low-key meal, grateful to be together, grateful to finally be settled in one place. But Owen had felt distracted, his mind always circling back to Dylan, to Riverside High, to the confrontation that was coming. When school had resumed the following Monday, the atmosphere had been electric with excitement about the upcoming state championship game. Posters and banners covered the walls. The PA system blared fight songs during passing periods, and the student body seemed unified in their obsession with football glory. Dylan had been the center of it all, soaking up the adulation, his confidence bordering on megalomania. Owen had walked through the school with a new awareness, seeing everything with clarity. He'd understood the dynamics at play, the way the entire institution had been built to support and protect athletes like Dylan. But he'd also understood that every system had its pressure points, and Dylan's armor wasn't as impenetrable as it seemed. The harassment had continued, but with a new edge. Dylan had seemed determined to push Owen into a response, to finally get that fight he'd been seeking. In the hallway, he'd body-checked Owen hard enough to slam him into the lockers. In the cafeteria, he'd deliberately tripped Owen, sending him sprawling in front of dozens of students. Each time, Owen had picked himself up calmly, met Dylan's eyes, and walked away. Each time, he'd seen Dylan's frustration growing. Lily had been worried, sensing the building tension. "Owen, he's trying to make you snap. Don't give him what he wants." But Owen had known something Lily didn't. He wasn't trying to avoid a confrontation anymore. He was choosing the time and place for it. He was taking control. The week before the championship game, Owen had finally approached Coach Martinez with a specific request. "Coach, the wrestling team has that exhibition match this Saturday, right? Open to anyone who wants to compete?" She'd looked at him with those sharp eyes, understanding immediately. "You want to enter?" "Yes, Mom." "You know who else usually competes in those?" "Yes, Mom." She'd studied him for a long moment. "This isn't about revenge, is it, Owen? Because if you're looking for payback, I can't support that. It's not about revenge. It's about proving I can stand up for myself, that I'm not afraid anymore." Coach Martinez had nodded slowly. "All right, I'll put your name in. But Owen, these matches have rules. You follow them. You compete with honor. Win or lose, you do it the right way. Clear?" "Crystal clear, ma'am." The exhibition wrestling matches were a Riverside High tradition, a fundraiser for the athletics program where students could sign up to compete in supervised matches. It was popular with the football players who liked to show off their strength in the off-season. Dylan had competed every year, usually dominating his opponents with a combination of size, athleticism, and aggression. Word had spread quickly that Owen Blake had signed up. The invisible ghost, the target of months of harassment, was going to step onto the mat. The student body had been buzzing with anticipation and disbelief. Some students had thought Owen was crazy. Others had seemed quietly hopeful, tired of Dylan's dominance, wanting to see someone challenge the established order. Dylan had sought Owen out the day the roster was posted. He'd found him in the library, of course, sitting with Lily. His approach had been different this time, less casual cruelty and more focused intensity. "You signed up for the wrestling exhibition," Dylan had said, not bothering with any preamble. Owen had looked up from his book. "I did. You realize what you're doing, right? You're going to humiliate yourself in front of the whole school. Maybe, or maybe not." Dylan had leaned in, hands on the table, his face close to Owen's. "I'm going to destroy you, ghost. I'm going to make you regret every time you looked at me, every moment you spent with her," jerking his head toward Lily. "You understand me?" Owen had met his eyes, steady and calm. "I understand you perfectly." For a moment, something had flickered in Dylan's expression, a hint of doubt or maybe respect, but it had vanished quickly, replaced by that familiar arrogance. "Saturday, then. See you on the mat." After Dylan had left, Lily had grabbed Owen's hand. "Tell me you know what you're doing." "I'm done running," Owen had said simply. "I'm done being afraid. Whatever happens Saturday, at least I'll know I stood up." The days leading up to Saturday had been intense. Owen had trained relentlessly, working with Coach Martinez on wrestling-specific techniques, blending them with his martial arts background. She'd been a demanding teacher, pushing him through drills, teaching him about leverage and balance, about using an opponent's strength against them. "Dylan's bigger and stronger," she'd said during one session. "But strength without technique is just noise. You're faster, you're more disciplined, and you're fighting for the right reasons. Remember that. You're not trying to hurt him. You're trying to prove you can't be hurt anymore." Sensei Takashi's lessons had come flooding back during those training sessions. The philosophy of martial arts wasn't about aggression. It was about centering yourself, about being unmovable in spirit even when your body was in motion. It was about the warrior's calm, the ability to face danger without fear, to defend without hatred. The nights had been harder. Owen had lain awake, his body sore from training, his mind running through scenarios. He'd thought about all the humiliations he'd endured, all the times he'd felt helpless and invisible. But he'd also thought about the person he was becoming, the strength he was discovering, not just in his body, but in his spirit. Lily had been his constant support, texting him encouragement, sitting with him at lunch, helping him stay centered when doubt crept in. On Friday, the day before the exhibition, she'd pulled him aside after school. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she'd said, "I'm proud of you. For training, for standing up for yourself, for not letting them break you. You're one of the bravest people I've ever met." Owen had felt something warm expand in his chest at her words. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Yes, you could have, but I'm glad I got to be part of it." They'd stood there in the empty hallway, the afternoon sun slanting through the windows, and Owen had kissed her. It had been gentle and certain, nothing like the aggressive violation Dylan had committed at the dance. This had been a question and an answer, a promise and a beginning. Saturday had arrived cold and bright, winter finally settling in for real. The exhibition matches were held in the gym, the bleachers packed with students and parents. The school band playing in one corner, the atmosphere festival-like, despite the competitive tension. Owen had arrived early, checked in with Coach Martinez, gotten his assigned warm-up time on the practice mats. The early matches had been entertaining, various students testing their skills, some clearly experienced wrestlers, and others just there for fun. The crowd had been energetic, cheering for everyone, the whole event feeling more like a celebration than serious competition. Owen's match against Dylan had been scheduled for the afternoon, allowing the crowd to build, maximizing the drama. As the time approached, Owen had felt surprisingly calm. All the training, all the preparation, all the mental work he'd done, it was ready. He was ready. In the locker room, changing into his wrestling gear, he'd caught his reflection in the mirror. The person looking back wasn't the scared, invisible kid who'd arrived at Riverside High 4 months ago. This person was leaner, stronger, his eyes clear and focused. This person knew who he was. Coach Martinez had found him before the match. "Remember what I taught you. Stay low, keep your center, use his aggression against him." And Owen, she'd paused, making sure he was listening. "You've already won just by stepping on that mat. Everything else is just proving what you already know." The gym had been packed when Owen walked out. Every seat filled, students standing along the walls, the noise deafening. He'd spotted Lily in the front row, her face anxious but hopeful. He'd spotted his parents too, his father giving him a small nod, his mother's hand pressed to her mouth. Dylan had entered from the other side to massive cheers, the golden boy in his element, soaking up the adoration. He'd looked confident, relaxed, his warm-up showing off the athletic ability that made him Riverside High's star. When their eyes had met across the mat, Dylan had smiled that predatory smile, certain of his victory. The referee had called them to center mat, explained the rules, checked their gear. Owen had used those moments to center himself, breathing deeply, finding that calm place inside where fear couldn't reach. He'd remembered every lesson, every hour of training, every reason he was here. The whistle had blown. Dylan had come in fast and aggressive, exactly as Owen had expected. He'd tried to use his size advantage immediately, going for a double-leg takedown that would have put a weaker opponent on their back instantly. But Owen had sprawled, his hips back, his weight distributed perfectly, just as Coach Martinez had drilled into him. Dylan's hands had found only air. They'd reset, circling each other. The crowd noise had faded for Owen, his entire focus on Dylan's body language, reading the tells that would signal the next attack. When it came, another aggressive shot, Owen had been ready. He'd used Dylan's momentum, circled to the side, got his own grip, and tried for a throw. It hadn't worked. Dylan was too strong, too experienced, but the attempt had registered in Dylan's expression. Surprise, maybe a hint of concern. The match had become a chess game of physical combat. Dylan would attack with power and confidence, and Owen would defend with technique and patience, occasionally countering with moves that Dylan clearly hadn't expected. The crowd had started to shift, their cheers becoming more complex, some supporting Dylan as always, but others beginning to recognize that Owen wasn't the easy victim they'd expected. 2 minutes in, Owen had managed his first takedown. It hadn't been pretty, more of a scramble than a clean technique, but he'd gotten Dylan to the mat. The referee's hand had slapped, awarding points, and Owen had felt a surge of confidence. He could do this. He was doing this. Dylan had gotten angry then, his composure slipping. When they'd reset, his attacks had become more aggressive but also sloppier, driven by emotion rather than strategy. Owen had remembered Coach Martinez's words about strength without technique being just noise. He'd started to see openings, opportunities. The turning point had come at the 4-minute mark. Dylan had shot in for another takedown, overcommitting, his balance forward and vulnerable. Owen had reacted on instinct, using a combination of his wrestling training and his martial arts background. He'd caught Dylan's momentum, twisted, and thrown him. It had been a beautiful, clean technique that Sensei Takashi would have been proud of. Dylan's larger body rotating through the air before hitting the mat with a heavy thud. The gym had erupted. Some students had been cheering, others had been gasping, all of them shocked by what they'd just seen. Owen had followed Dylan to the mat, secured the pin position, and held it while the referee counted. Dylan had tried to bridge out, his strength evident, but Owen had maintained control, his weight distributed perfectly, his technique solid. When the referee had slapped the mat, signaling the pin, there had been a moment of absolute silence in the gym. Owen had released Dylan and stood up, offering his hand in the traditional gesture of sportsmanship. Dylan had laid there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. Finally, Dylan had taken Owen's hand and stood up. The referee had raised Owen's arm, declaring him the winner, and the gym had exploded with noise. Some students had been cheering wildly, excited by the upset. Others had been silent, processing what they'd just witnessed. The entire social order of Riverside High had just been challenged on a very public stage. Owen had looked out at the crowd, found Lily's face, seen her jumping and cheering, tears streaming down her face. He'd found his parents, his father standing and clapping slowly, his mother crying. He'd found Coach Martinez, who'd been nodding with satisfaction. In the locker room afterward, alone for a moment while the remaining matches continued outside, Owen had sat on the bench and let it all wash over him. The fear he'd carried for months, the humiliation, the sense of helplessness, all of it had been transformed into this moment. He hadn't destroyed Dylan. He'd simply proven that Dylan couldn't destroy him. The door had opened and Dylan had walked in. Owen had tensed, prepared for anything. But Dylan had just stood there, still in his wrestling gear, his usual arrogance replaced by something more complex. "I underestimated you," Dylan had finally said. Owen had nodded. "You did. Where'd you learn to fight like that?" "I've been training my whole life. You just never bothered to find out." Dylan had been quiet for a long moment. "Look, about all the stuff before, the cafeteria, the dance, Lily. Yeah, I don't really know why I did all that. I guess I just..." Dylan had seemed to struggle with the words. "You were easy, you know. And I liked feeling powerful." That's pathetic, isn't it? Owen had studied Dylan's face, seeing the person behind the bully for maybe the first time. "Yeah, it is, but at least you can recognize it now. Are we cool?" Owen had thought about that question, about all the pain and humiliation of the past months, about the part of him that wanted to hold on to the anger, to make Dylan really pay. But he'd also thought about Sensei Takashi, about the difference between strength and cruelty, about being the person he wanted to be, rather than the person his worst moments might make him. "We're not friends," Owen had said carefully, "and you hurt me and Lily a lot. That doesn't just go away. But I'm not interested in revenge or making you suffer, so we're done. You stay away from me and Lily, and we're done." Dylan had nodded slowly. Fair enough. He'd started to leave, then turned back. "For what it's worth, that throw was incredible. You really could have hurt me if you'd wanted to." "I know," Owen had said. "That's the point." The rest of the day had been surreal. Owen had wandered through the still-packed gym, students stopping him to congratulate him, to ask him questions, to suddenly see him after months of looking right through him. Some had been genuinely supportive, impressed by his skill and courage. Others had just been drawn to the drama, to the social earthquake that had just reshaped Riverside High's hierarchy. Lily had found him, thrown her arms around him, held him tight while the crowd swirled around them. "You did it," she'd whispered. "I knew you could." Trevor and Brandon had kept their distance, their entire social identity tied to Dylan's status, and clearly uncertain how to navigate this new reality. Owen had seen them watching him, calculating, trying to figure out who he was now that he wasn't their victim anymore. In the weeks that followed, life at Riverside High had changed in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. Dylan had kept his distance, his behavior around school noticeably more subdued. The championship game had happened without Owen's attendance, Riverside losing in the final minutes, and while the school had mourned the loss, Dylan's status as an untouchable golden boy had been permanently altered. The harassment had stopped completely. The hallways Owen had learned to avoid were safe now. The cafeteria where he'd been humiliated was just a cafeteria again. Students who'd never acknowledged his existence before now nodded in the hallways, said hello, treated him like a person rather than a ghost. But the most profound changes had been internal. Owen had discovered something essential about himself during those months of suffering and training and eventual triumph. He'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. He'd learned that strength without compassion was just brutality, but compassion without strength was just weakness. He'd learned that being a warrior wasn't about seeking conflict, but about being prepared for it, about having the ability to defend yourself and choosing to use that ability wisely. Coach Martinez had pulled him aside one day after practice, her expression proud. "You know what impressed me most about that match? Not the technique, though that was solid, not the victory, though you earned it. It was your restraint. You could have hurt him badly in several moments and you chose not to. That's real strength." His relationship with Lily had deepened into something both of them recognized as significant. They'd started openly dating, sitting together at lunch without fear, walking hand in hand through hallways that had once felt hostile. She'd continued her art, creating a series of photographs documenting transformation and resilience, using Owen as her primary subject. The images had been powerful, capturing something essential about vulnerability and strength. His family life had stabilized too. His father had congratulated him after the match, told him he was proud, but had also reminded him that the real test would be how he conducted himself going forward. His mother had been relieved that the tension she'd sensed in Owen for months seemed to have lifted. His sister had bragged about her brother to her friends, suddenly seeing him as cool rather than just her awkward older sibling. As winter had deepened into January, Owen had found himself reflecting on the entire experience during his early morning runs through frost-covered streets. The quiet new kid who'd arrived at Riverside High in August barely resembled the person he'd become. But more than that, he'd learned that sometimes you had to be broken down before you could build yourself back up stronger. He'd learned that standing up for yourself wasn't a single moment, but a series of small decisions, each one reinforcing your sense of self-worth. He'd learned that people would treat you the way you taught them to treat you, and that accepting humiliation as inevitable only ensured more humiliation. He'd learned that sometimes the adults in your life couldn't or wouldn't protect you, and you had to become capable of protecting yourself. But most importantly, he'd learned the difference between being a victim and being vulnerable, between being weak and being peaceful, between being strong and being aggressive. The martial arts lessons he'd learned from Sensei Takashi, the discipline coach Martinez had reinforced, the support Lily had provided, all of it had combined to teach him a fundamental truth. Real strength was choosing not to use your power even when you could, defending yourself when necessary, but never seeking to harm others unnecessarily. Dylan had actually apologized properly about 3 weeks after the wrestling match. He'd found Owen in the library, ironically, and had sat down without invitation. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not knowing why I did all that stuff to you. I think I do know, actually. My dad, he's this huge presence in my life. Everything I do is about living up to his expectations, being the golden boy he wants me to be. And I hate it sometimes. The pressure, the feeling like I'm not a person, but just this symbol of his success. So I took it out on you because you seemed free of all that. You didn't care about being popular or fitting in or any of the stuff that drives this place. And I resented you for it. That doesn't excuse anything, but it's the truth." Owen had listened, understanding more than he wanted to admit about the weight of parental expectations and the feeling of being trapped in someone else's vision of who you should be. "That's honest, at least." "I'm trying to be better," Dylan had said. "Not just because you beat me, though that definitely woke me up, but because I looked at myself and didn't like what I saw. So yeah, I'm sorry. Really sorry. They'd never become friends, but they'd reached a kind of peace. They'd nod to each other in the hallways, maintain respectful distance, acknowledge each other's humanity without pretending the past hadn't happened. Trevor and Brandon had been slower to change, their identities more completely tied to being Dylan's enforcers. But without Dylan's active encouragement, their harassment had faded to occasional dirty looks and muttered comments that Owen found easy to ignore. They'd become irrelevant rather than threatening, which was its own form of victory. By February, Owen had been thinking about the future in ways he hadn't allowed himself before. He'd started seriously considering which colleges to apply to, what he wanted to study, who he wanted to become. Lily had been planning her art school applications, and they'd spent long hours talking about their dreams, about life beyond Riverside High, about the people they were becoming. On Valentine's Day, Lily had given Owen a photograph she'd taken of him during one of his morning runs. The image had caught him mid-stride, steam from his breath visible in the cold air, his face determined but peaceful, the rising sun backlighting him. She titled it, "Warrior at Dawn." "This is how I see you," she'd said. "Not the scared kid trying to be invisible, not the fighter in the wrestling match, but this, someone who's found their strength and uses it to move forward, not to hurt others." Owen had looked at the photograph, seeing himself through Lily's artistic lens, and had recognized the truth in her vision. He had become a warrior, not in the sense of seeking battle, but in the sense of being prepared for life's challenges, of facing difficulties with courage and grace, of protecting what mattered without becoming what he fought against. The spring semester had brought new challenges and opportunities. Owen had continued training with Coach Martinez, his skills improving steadily. She'd suggested he join the wrestling team next year, and he'd been considering it. He'd also reconnected with martial arts more formally, finding a dojo in town run by a former student of Sensei Takashi, creating that connection to his past while building his future. His grades had improved dramatically once the constant anxiety of harassment had lifted. Teachers had noticed his participation in class, his thoughtful contributions to discussions. He'd even joined the photography club at Lily's encouragement, discovering an unexpected interest in capturing moments and telling stories through images. The school itself had seemed to shift in subtle ways after Owen's public victory. There had been a recognition that the social hierarchies weren't as fixed as everyone had believed, that status could be challenged, that victims could become victors without becoming villains. A few other students who'd been quietly bullied had found the courage to speak up, to report incidents to teachers, to demand better treatment. The administration had been forced to take notice, to implement actual anti-bullying measures rather than just giving lip service to the concept. Coach Martinez had told Owen that he'd changed Riverside High's culture in ways he probably didn't fully appreciate. "You showed everyone that you don't have to accept being treated badly, that you can stand up for yourself without becoming cruel, that strength and kindness aren't opposites. That matters, Owen. That really matters." As spring had turned to early summer and the end of the school year had approached, Owen had found himself reflecting on the entire journey from that scared, invisible kid in August to the confident, balanced person he'd become. The transformation hadn't been quick or easy. It had required pain and perseverance, training and discipline, support and courage. But it had been worth it. The final week of school had brought the usual chaos of finals and yearbook signings and emotional farewells. Dylan had actually approached Owen on the last day, both of them standing in the parking lot in the late afternoon sun. "I'm going to state for football," Dylan had said. "Full ride, exactly what my dad wanted." "Congratulations," Owen had said, and meant it. "What about you?" "Still figuring it out. Maybe engineering. Maybe something else." "I've got options now that my grades are better," Dylan had nodded. "Look, I know we're not friends and probably never will be. But I wanted you to know that match, what you did, it actually helped me. It made me realize I didn't want to be that person anymore, the bully, the jerk who treated people like they didn't matter. So thanks, I guess. They'd shaken hands, two people who'd traveled very different paths, but had reached a similar understanding about strength and character and the kind of men they wanted to become. The graduation ceremony, which Owen wouldn't participate in for another year but attended to watch his senior friends graduate, had been both an ending and a beginning. He'd sat with Lily, watching students he'd known only as names or faces walk across the stage, and he'd thought about his own future graduation, about the person he'd be when that day came. That summer had been transformative in a different way. Owen had gotten a job working construction with a crew his father knew, physical labor that complemented his training and gave him a sense of accomplishment. He'd continued training daily, his discipline now a fundamental part of who he was, rather than a response to external threat. He and Lily had spent long days together, driving to the lake, exploring the town, talking about everything and nothing. His parents had noticed the change in him, the confidence and peace he carried now. His father had told him one evening, sitting on the back porch watching the sunset, "You've become a man this year, son. Not because of the fight or the victory, but because of how you handled it. You learned the hardest lesson, that real strength is knowing when to use it and when to walk away." As the summer had worn on and Owen had prepared for his return to Riverside High for his next year, he'd felt a mix of emotions. There would still be challenges, still be moments of difficulty, still be people who saw him as the ghost or the kid who beat Dylan rather than as himself. But he knew now that he could handle whatever came. He'd been tested in ways that had almost broken him, and he'd not just survived, but grown stronger. The heavy bag in his room, worn smooth from months of daily practice, had become a symbol of his transformation. Every punch, every kick, every combination had been a meditation, a prayer, a conversation with his better self. The discipline it represented had spread through every aspect of his life, his studies, his relationships, his daily choices. He'd learned that martial arts, as Sensei Takashi had always taught, wasn't about fighting. It was about balance, physical balance, yes, but also mental and spiritual balance. The balance between confidence and humility, between strength and compassion, between standing your ground and knowing when to let go. It was about being centered in yourself so completely that external chaos couldn't shake your internal peace. Owen Blake had arrived at Riverside High as a ghost, invisible and afraid. He'd been systematically humiliated and broken down, pushed to the edge of his endurance. But he'd found something essential in that darkness, the core of who he truly was, stronger than the fear, more resilient than the pain. He'd learned to stand up not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. He'd learned that true victory wasn't about defeating others, but about refusing to be defeated. As September approached and the new school year loomed, Owen had stood in his room one evening, the setting sun painting everything gold. He'd looked at the photo Lily had taken, Warrior at Dawn, and had recognized the journey it represented. From darkness to light, from weakness to strength, from humiliation to redemption. Not through revenge or cruelty, but through discipline, courage, and the understanding that real power was choosing restraint even when you had the ability to harm. The story of Owen Blake and Dylan Hartwell had become something of a legend at Riverside High, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy. But the truth of it, the real story, was simpler and more profound than any legend. It was about a young person who refused to accept a victim's role, who found the courage to change not just their circumstances but themselves, who learned that standing up for yourself was the first step toward becoming the person you were meant to be. Owen had transformed from victim to victor, not in a single moment of violence, but through months of patient, disciplined growth. The wrestling match had been dramatic and satisfying, yes, But it had been the culmination of countless small victories. Each time he chose training over despair. Each time he centered himself instead of lashing out in anger. Each time he treated himself with the respect he deserved, even when others wouldn't. As he'd returned to Riverside High that fall, walking through those familiar doors with his shoulders back and his head high, Owen had carried with him the knowledge that he'd earned. He was no longer the scared new kid. He was no longer Dylan Hartwell's victim. He was Owen Blake, a young man who'd faced his fears and overcome them, who'd been broken down and built himself back up stronger, who'd learned the most important lesson of all, that real strength comes from within, and once you find it, no one can take it away from you again.